go into the program and allow, like, Kindle books, they have DRM in them that prevent you from sharing them with other people. So if you were to go into it and alter the program code to allow you to share the document, that's against terms of service, and you can, like, if you were to go to court with Amazon, Amazon would win that case. And, like, there's something very weird about that. Like, I buy a book, a physical book, I can do whatever I want. I buy a Kindle book, and I can get fined and possibly jailed for trying to give it to somebody else. Like, that is like a fundamental, and there's no laws for me to point to because Amazon's got all the cards. So.
Yeah, that's you brought up two of the points that I was gonna bring up, like the companies themselves being self-interested and only fulfilling like their goals and their wants and needs for the copyright issue, and then also like the protection of that like material. Like they're gonna go to every extent to make sure that something like that doesn't happen on an ebook or a digital file, and the consumer has no like protection. Whereas that's why I feel like the law should be focused more on copyright and not on patents, because the patents I think are fine. Like people are gonna try to invent things. They're gonna see the legitimacy in their process, and if it's new and original, then they'll get it. But the copyright issue is becoming like a major issue, like to me.
And one thing I should say about patents is another thing that's tough with computer programs and patents is that this line of novel seems to be really complicated. Going back over here, like if you come up with a new program which does something which has never been done before, but 99.5% of the code is something which is borrowed from various sorts of places, but you've just taken the last little bit, added some, using it in a new way for a new process, then is that novel or is that not novel? And it doesn't seem like there's an easy way of saying this. On the one hand, you can say like, okay, the end goal is different. You're doing something slightly different with this process. But on the other hand, it's like, well, you're doing something slightly different, but like, if I decide to take a car engine, like imagine that my basement floods. I don't have a basement, but imagine that I did, and imagine it flooded. And I take my car engine out of my car, hook it up to a pump, and use my car engine to pump out the water. And I now say, look, I invented something new, I want a patent on this. All I did was attach a vacuum hose to my car engine. Should I really be allowed to be told that this is now patentable because it's novel? Doesn't necessarily seem like it, even though I'm using it for something new.
A flood cleaner?
Yeah, I would say like, this is my Honda Civic flood cleaner. And you're like, no, that's just a Honda Civic with a vacuum hose attached. You're like, brand new, no one's ever thought of this before. It's like, that you literally are just taking your car engine, which somebody else invented, you don't now get to call this new. And so this is another issue, because that is a lot more like what code is. If you're working with code, very often if there's like a particular process you need within it, like say, something to run numbers back around, you're probably not gonna like invent it yourself. You're probably gonna use something which you've either heard of in the past, or you're gonna go to some open source website and just copy something that you know works from there. And now at the end, you're like, oh, now can I really get this patented or copyrighted? And it's starting to seem like maybe not. And so in both of these cases, it seems like we need something new, like somewhere between copyright, patents, and just something totally brand new. Because right now, you have very little control over the things you buy on the internet. Like the major difference is, when you used to buy something, you then had total control over it. Now when you buy something, you don't have absolute, complete, and total control over it. And the interesting thing is, as more and more and more pieces of technology are becoming smart technology, you're having less and less and less control. So for instance, like if you have there are things that you are not allowed to do with your phone. Like your phone is yours, but there are definite rules about what you're allowed to do with it. Also, if you have any sort of like Bluetooth anything, there can be rules over what you're allowed to do with it. And so there's this way in which the consumer, even though we have access to more things, the things that we have access to, we have less control over. Like you aren't allowed to just go in and change how your operating system works. You aren't allowed to shut off certain parts of the system. Like if you don't want something to track you, certain programs will then cease to allow you to use them. And so that's just like a major difference from the way in the past. In the past, you didn't want to You owned it, you could do whatever you want. Now, you own it, but you don't have complete ownership. And the companies who design it have more power than ever before because they still have some control over what you're buying, which is just a totally different sort of thing. And we have no laws to fall back on to help us. Any other questions, comments, concerns on this point? Just one other thing to point out here, just about piracy, like internet piracy. And so rather than talking about software, let's just talk about, books and Kindles and digital exchange. Because why was it that copyright law was invented in the first place? We said on the one hand, it was going to reward the people who designed or came up with ideas. But who benefited from copyright existing?
The people who invented copyright.
People who had the copyright, but also you as somebody who lived in the world and didn't have the copyright, did you benefit? When somebody invented or wrote a new book, did the fact that there was copyright help you out?
Yes.
How so?
Because if you buy the main book, you can cost you price more.
Yeah, so here's the thing, is as copyright came into existence, the people who had the copyright, because they could get paid, were going to try to exchange it and spread it out. So there was a sense in which copyright was originally designed not only to reward the people who came up with ideas, but also to increase the spread of ideas. So the idea was, because you could make money off of it, you could then develop a printing house. And once you had a publishing or printing house, you could print copies. And because you could make money printing copies, you could then sell copies, which would allow more and more and more people to access the book. So copyright was helping the spread of ideas and information, because the very fact you could make money off of it was giving people reason to build the infrastructure to exchange ideas. Nowadays, does copyright increase the spread of ideas or decrease it? If we all were to follow all copyright laws at all times, given what technology is like now, would there be more or less of a spread of ideas? Decrease. Because the fact is, now that exchange has become so easy, the same laws which were originally designed to allow us to spread ideas and allow more people to access them are now preventing us from spreading ideas. So it used to be the case that if I had a book, the copyright gave a publisher reason to build machines and make copies for me. And if that publisher couldn't make money, no one would have made the copies, no one would have read the books, because they wouldn't have been printed. Now, the copyright is saying, you aren't allowed to make that copy. You aren't allowed to exchange it. So what was originally designed to help us get ideas out there are now keeping us from spreading things. And it's this interesting thing where the technology has now gotten so far ahead that the very laws which helped us get to this point are now holding us at that point. And we cannot exchange information as quickly as we could if the laws weren't there. And so that's just another major issue with copyright. And one issue with this, though, is so it used to be the case that the same laws which helped the authors and got people rewards for doing things also benefited society as a whole. Now they seem to be pulling in opposite directions, where the laws which allow you to get paid for your ideas are now preventing people from getting access to those ideas as much as they otherwise could. And so it seems like just the technology and the rewards are pulling in opposite directions for the first time in history, which has led to some major, differences, which has led to, these days, most people don't actually buy a lot of pieces of intellectual property like they used to. We now seem to rent much more. So what are some examples in which the nature of these changes has led to us renting as opposed to buying?
Like movies, where you watch movies online.
Yeah. Netflix is basically renting movies. You pay a monthly fee, and you get access to whatever Netflix decides to let you have access to.
You have to go to the cinema, or you have to buy the actual movie.
Yeah, so in the old days,
you can watch like 60 billion.
You buy, so the exchange is, you have access to more movies, but you never own a movie on Netflix in the way you used to own a DVD or a cassette. You cannot own it in the same way. You are renting it. You are renting the right to see that movie. Same thing with Spotify. Spotify is basically just like a real estate company for music. You pay them a monthly fee, they give you access to music, or you watch ads, they give you access to music. So there's this sense in which the just overall landscape has changed. We own a lot less stuff than we used to, in some ways. Like, we have access to more, but we have less control over the things we have access to. So it's just like a fundamental changing of the landscape. It's also changed the landscape for producers of content. So, 50 years ago, how did most musicians make their money?
Concerts?
It was records. Records and recorded music was most of the money. Now, most musicians make their money touring.
Yeah.
That is how most musicians make their money. So, these days, the touring schedules for bands are much higher than they used to be. Like, the final 3 or 4 years they were together, the Beatles, I don't think, performed a single show. They just went to the studio and made records. Nowadays, if you were a musical band who didn't tour, you would have no money. And this is why every new musical act appears on Jimmy Fallon the first week within their new record. It's like, this is the only way you make money. And so that's just a major change. And I mean, bands are making more, there are different ways in which bands are making money. And bands are still existing, we're still making money, things are still going well. It's just a totally different sort of lifestyle. Used to be, they could just go and if you read about what the Beatles did, it was basically they were young and they were big and they made a lot of shows and made some music, and then somewhere along the line they got big enough that they just started recording, and then they went on a drug-infused trip to India in which they just for a few months just got high and were creative, and then came back to the studio and made some new crazy music, and then didn't, and it's just a totally different thing. These days it's, you look at a musician's touring and it's just night after night after night after night of show. And it doesn't mean that it's necessarily worse or better, it's just different. And these days, if you want to survive as a band, you're touring all the time. The same thing, though, with bands is the other side of this is you can now make it big in ways that you couldn't before. Back in the day, if you wanted to make it big as a musician, what was step number one guaranteed? If you didn't do this, you were screwed? You need a record deal. Because it was records, you needed that record deal. Nowadays, how can you get discovered if you don't have a record deal? YouTube. You can now get big in ways that you never could before, and you can develop a following so much more easily if you present yourself to the right people in the right ways. So isn't that how Bieber got big? It was originally a YouTube video? Justin Bieber is one of the most famous musicians around today, for better or worse. And he got big because he was a 12-year-old singing into YouTube. That couldn't have happened before. Nowadays, though, that's how we got to start. Or you have all of these bands who can, get off the ground without going through record companies.
Even SoundCloud.
Yeah, so SoundCloud, that's another one where you post your own music, somebody finds it. It's also not very hard if you want to get your music onto Spotify. I'm sure you have all met some, pardon? Yeah, it's really not, I know people who are on Spotify, and I met them once at the park. Yeah, I'm on Spotify. I'm oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Now anybody in the world can get access to your music. It used to be hidden down in the basement, check out my new mixtape. Totally different sort of vibe. And same thing with movies, is you can become a name just making YouTube videos. Think about the number of people whose main career is being an Instagram influencer. That is not a thing that would have existed.
You can see some of the biggest social media influencers came from Vine. 7-second videos. David Dobrik is so rich, and he just made so.
Do you know how much money somebody on who's Ninja? Anyone know who I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Tyler Blevins.
Yeah, Tyler Blevins. He is a Twitch streamer. Anyone know how much he makes a month?
I didn't know.
Yeah, he's bringing in $12 million a year just sitting in front of a computer screen because he's an interesting enough character for people to enjoy watching him play video games. That is something totally new which would not have existed, and it's opened up markets which never would have before. So it's just a totally different sort of animal.
I was going to say Microsoft just paid him a whole lot of money to leave Twitch and go to their platform.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, so he's now rolling in even more dough. And I mean, like, you never see him go anywhere without like a Red
Yeah,
Bull
he is
can because
sponsored.
Red Bull's paying him a ton of money. Yeah.
I mean, he has his own merch line for sure.
Yeah, he's got his own merch line. Like he's.
a sponsor now.
On the other side, though, like, has anyone ever read like any articles about what it's like to be a Twitch streamer? It is
In no
exhausting.
way.
Like, if you go on vacation for a month, like you go away for a month, people will leave your channel and you will see an economic downturn. So the other side of it is fundamentally different, and you have to be on all the time. Like, you cannot be boring, like, or you will start to lose viewers. The other difference is, in the old days, if you had a terrible thought and you said it out loud, nobody saw. Now you have something because you haven't slept in 24 hours and you're annoyed and you say something inappropriate. The odds are, at some point, if you're streaming your life all the time, you're gonna say something which is kind of off color. And also, if you've been spending most of your time on the internet, in the like cesspool that is the dark, or Reddit and other sorts of places, the odds are you are getting some ideas which are not ideal to be said out loud. So there's this other side of it too, which is that we have all these new ways, but they're leading to lots of other questions as well. And anytime you read anything about any big Twitch star or YouTube celebrity, and you just like look up scandal, like so-and-so scandal, you will get tons of stories. Like no matter, like even like the nicest, sweetest, like YouTube person who all they do is post cat videos, I bet you're gonna find some
Smosh.
scandal involving them.
Smosh.
So we went a little off topic there, just because this is actually going to lead us into the next parts of the semester, which are like, given that this is the environment and there aren't these laws, how do we regulate it? And how do we keep people from saying horrible things on the internet? And there's not a very nice, clear answer for a lot of these technology reasons we just said. All right, for now though, let us stop and take our break. It is 12:15. Come back at 12:30 and we'll talk about papers for an hour. Go.